So can we open it up for questions? I'm just going to give Heather some chance to get caught up on things that have come in through the chat box. So any questions from folks first in the room? And we're in a med school and where I teach a lot and I'm comfortable with silence, so I'm going to wait you out. Yeah, so if you want to go first, yeah, just push that button. We should hear a bleep. No? Has someone else got their, can you turn yours off for a sec? Oh. Sorry, we'll come to you in a sec. Sorry. Yeah, there we go.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate what you're, sorry, I should introduce myself, Mark here from Woodstock Hospital.
Super.
Just in terms of, again, wrapping our minds around this population-based kind of thinking of those folks in our community, would you think it's advisable to start to work with municipalities and planners to understand not only current snapshot of our communities, but future projections, new industry that may be coming in? I know certain communities, including Woodstock, have grown quite a bit in size.
Yeah.
And so just your thoughts on trying to anticipate not just today's issues, but the future.
Yeah, it's a good idea. As no one's actually mentioned that to us before. I thought the path you were going to go down with the municipal folks is that the municipal policymakers often have municipal budgets that include housing and an array of social services like Ontario Works and other things, and that is an incredibly important piece of the package. So right now there is no talk about integrating that budget with the Ontario Health Team budget, but those are absolutely key participants. So we've seen many teams that have the city manager or the number 2 in the city sitting at the planning table as a full member of the team because they provide assets that are absolutely essential. So if you think back to some of the challenges that we experience with what's been labeled hallway medicine, a part of the challenge is just a lack of housing options for people, and specifically supportive housing and with wraparound social services. So municipalities are absolutely key in that conversation. So even if those budgets remain in perpetuity separate from Ontario Health Teams, they're an absolutely essential partner. But what you said that was new to me, which I think is a really interesting option, is speaking to them also about where do they see the community going over time. Because Ontario Health Teams are going to have to be anticipatory in how they think about planning for the future. So that's something that we can certainly add to our thinking and share that with other people, but it wasn't on our radar before. Can we jump to you? Sorry for missing the cue. You do? So is yours unpressed? Yep, great. There we go.
So what's the, we haven't heard what the process is to submit or resubmit the in-development application.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through the next steps, the timelines or deadlines?
Yeah. So I can walk you through what I've heard. Like you're always welcome to ask, officially what the response is. What I have heard is that teams that are in development will not have to resubmit their self-assessment. So you do not have to revisit that process. The other thing that I've heard is that the ministry is actively working on what a transparent process will look like for you to go through to trigger your ability then to move into the full application process. So no timeline has been released, and what those requirements will be for you to move to that next step haven't yet been fully articulated, but that will come. So don't have to worry about redoing the self-assessment. My advice would be keep thinking, keep pushing forward, and know that at some point that timeline and that process is going to be made clear. I think the ministry is responding to many, many competing demands, and it's trying to move as fast as it can, and it's trying to juggle those things of helping the teams moving forward while being in a position to quickly say to you, here's what we expect in terms of next steps. Heather, some online questions? Yep. Oh, can everybody just make sure their mic is turned off? Shouldn't be lit up in front of them. There we go.
So question from online and a comment. I appreciate the one-stop resource directory online. Wondering if you also have coach/mentors accessible to groups planning their submissions.
Yeah, so not yet. As Karen mentioned, the focus initially is on general supports that would apply across everybody. The ministry remains very open to insights about what would be helpful to teams. So if you or others feel that individualized coaching would be helpful, I'd encourage you to communicate that to the ministry. And then the ministry over time, as Karen said, is planning to act on what they hear the needs are and then incrementally add resources. So coaching is not something that RISE has direct experience with, but there are many partners in the system that have a lot of experience with individualized coaching, and those partners could be drawn on then to help to provide coaching to teams if that is a well-articulated need coming from teams.
It's Heather again. I would just also add to that to say that in some ways there's peer coaching opportunities available by once you kind of find others who are struggling with the same ideas or at the same kind of spot in their journey or the same priority populations. There's so many ways that you could be linked up depending on what your interests are and where your needs are. So there is that ability. And I think, you know, watching some of these teams go through these early days of trying to get to their full application, they're trying out different strategies. So they'll have early feedback to share with some of those who have that little bit longer runway.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, over to you.
Yeah, Andy Craker, Whistledown Community Health Center. I guess one of the building somewhat on that is one of the challenges is now we've got a great task list of 58 tasks that we need to do, but where's the support for the relationship building part of it, right? Because 70% of change efforts fail primarily because we don't focus enough on developing the relationships. We try to rush to the task and get a task checked off before we built the relationships. And you mentioned that a little bit in terms of the challenges of building with primary care. So where are resources, potential facilitators that can help us with this? We're not looking for high-priced consultants, but we don't have an academic health sciences center as part of our team, so we don't necessarily have resources that we can second or pull away to do this, right? So how, from an equity perspective, which is important for community health centers, like how do we make sure that some of the smaller teams get access to some of these resources that help us build the relationships that we need to go in parallel with the task?
Yeah, super. So, I mean, the answer again is communicate that, and we will communicate that as well, that there's value for some teams to have the individualized coaching, but also the neutral facilitators who really understand how health systems work, understand CHCs, all the players, but they don't have skin in the game in that community, and they can play that neutral broker role. We see some teams looking to people from the local health integration networks. My sense is that folks that are working in the LHINs are kind of cautious about getting involved because they're now reporting up to Ontario Health. They know that they're being that dynamic is changing, but there are often people in local health integration networks that can act in that neutral facilitation role. So that's an existing resource where a request might be met by them. But I think that if you feel that that's helpful, and we've heard that from some other teams, we should be communicating that into the ministry, and then they'll take that on board in the next wave. So Karen was very clear that these are just first steps. So a first step is get the one-stop shop up and running, get some key RISE briefs out that apply across everybody, and then over time, iteratively add in the pieces. I think RISE is likely to, more often than not, stay at the level of things that might be shared across multiple teams as opposed to the individualized, but we see huge complementarities of folks that can be neutral facilitators, individualized coaches, that kind of stuff. So I would encourage you to communicate it, because if they only hear it from us, it doesn't have the same gravitas if it comes from you. Other questions or comments?
It's Robert Byron from St. Thomas Hospital.
Yep.
Keep this on, sorry. Just building on Andy's point around supports and resources. So just reflecting on the preparation of the initial application.
Yep.
The hospital had a staff support that was dedicated to pull it together, facilitate a smaller working group with our partners. That was a temporary resource and quite substantive one. So when I look at the full application, its sheer size and enormity, it's quite detailed. We don't have the resources, certainly the hospital doesn't, in order to have, and I'm not looking for expensive consultants, certainly agree with that, but in-house supports that we could dedicate to this. We can't do this on the side of our desk.
Yeah.
And so I guess the message to, the ministry on this is, particularly for the smaller OHT applicants, there ought to be some form of financial support so that we can actually have a staff member project manage this, even some governance expertise. And finally, it's related to this, the whole legal piece, which really hasn't surfaced here. But we talk about governance structures, which are going to be probably the most difficult and issues of resolution and bringing our partners together. And there's so many permutations. And so at some point, though, if you're going to have a decision-making framework or leadership structure that includes a memorandum of understanding, for example, at minimum, would require some sort of legal counsel. And so either the ministry ought to template that for OHT so that it's one cost for the entire province, maybe varied options of MOUs, alternatively, perhaps resources that would allow OHTs to procure that directly. So I'm just sending a cautionary note that it might be unrealistic for the smaller OHTs that don't have large hospitals or academic centers, that this is going to be financially a strain.
On the latter point, absolutely. I mean, it would be such. If there are legal folks on the call looking for business opportunities, they won't appreciate my comment, but I just think it would be a terrible waste for every single team to be going through this over and over and over and over again. And so our intent very much is to identify, if people are willing to share templates, we can strip out the identifiers and share them as models. But there are also groups, like we understand the Ontario Hospital Association is kind of actively moving into the space to try and help people. The Ontario Medical Association is doing work related to governance. There could be over time added to the central program of supports a group that has a particular focus on leadership, accountability, and governance. So I think you'll see more and more stuff coming online, and I really think the approach has to be a variety of templates that you can then choose whichever one might be appropriate to you and then make adaptations. In terms of the kind of support, right now the message is there are no resources to teams, and I recognize it's an issue. I see even teams that to me are incredibly well resourced in terms of how big the hospital budgets are for the participating partners who seem to be having incredible difficulty just paying an FTE, which I find interesting. I mean, I know they run big, complex organizations, but for the biggest transformation and the most high-impact transformation we will ever probably see in our lifetime in Ontario, and a big hospital is struggling with how to make available one FTE. So that I find a little bit surprising, but I certainly can appreciate with smaller institutions that the challenges would be magnified. So, but I guess what I'd say now is people are somehow making good of it in the short term, but I think if you feel it's a rate limiting factor, you should communicate it. It's not our job. Like we can't do that, but if you feel that that's absolutely essential, then it would be good to share it. Heather?
I'm just throwing this out there, but I was going to suggest the OHA as well, because I in my old job, I was working on some collaborative governance agreements amongst several hospitals, and I think that would look kind of similar working with legal, so look kind of similar to what some of the OHTs want to do, and I'm sure you could get those through the OHA. But also, I wonder if we couldn't use our boards as assets. Many of our boards have lawyers, many of our boards. So I think we need to think creatively as well about where the assets are. So maybe somebody's board member is a lawyer who does these types of agreements and who wouldn't mind at least, providing a bit of advice. Is certainly from the perspective of understanding how the organization's interests relate to the agreement, but just trying to think a little bit more creatively about what we already have in systems and how to mobilize that for this effort. And
another creative, potentially creative solution would be, the 31 teams that have moved forward to full application. It's certainly the ones we're seeing typically have an FTE staff person. But once they have gone through all of these steps with that team, it could be that, buying 1 day a week of their time for 3 months would give you, in a very condensed way, a lot of what you would need. It might not solve all of the problems, and they're not going to have that local contextual knowledge, but it could be there could be over time assets that serve multiple teams in efficient ways rather than having to have the asset in each place and every individual having to learn. Because when we watch those focal points on teams, I almost find it heartbreaking that it just feels like each of them is going through exactly the same struggle. And because we've just kind of appeared on the scene, we haven't yet had a chance to connect them. And they're under the gun having to meet this October 9th deadline. So anything that takes them away feels like a distraction. But once we hit October 9th, those people are going to be able to come up for air and start to be much more planful and start to interact with their peers and share lessons learned. And it could become the case that they become assets that could be brought into other groups. But if you really feel that the financial resources are a rate limiting step for small communities, then think about, given these options, what you think would be an optimal solution and what the magnitude of the request would be, and then communicate it to the ministry. Any other questions or comments online? Can we just check if there's any other questions or comments from folks in the room? Yep.
Sorry.
Are you on? No, go ahead.
I'm
I
ready.
saw someone else leaning forward. Is your mic on?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay. I'm Cindy Brad. I'm the Executive Director for East Elgin Family Health Team. And I'm interested just in speaking about the primary care providers a bit. We know that we need to have their trust and their understanding to move the Ontario Health teams forward. Certainly without the engagement of the primary care providers, we're not moving anywhere. Yep. They're at the base of this.
Absolutely.
And historically, the primary care providers and the ministry don't have a good relationship, and there is not the trust there. So we can build trust, you know, at our level. But is there any plan, or what is the plan for the ministry to build relationships with the primary care providers? How are they informing them of the Ontario Health teams? What is their conversation, if any, that's happening with them? And do they have any plans to such as incentivizing or proposing a salary, or, you know, a lot would really disagree with me on that, but are they planning anything to get the buy-in from the primary care providers?
Yeah. So I mean, unfortunately, I can't answer the policy question.
Mm-hmm.
So if you feel that there are things you want to bring to the ministry's attention, I encourage you to write in. And I'm not sure that they can answer the specific questions right now. I think the ministry has signaled very strongly that if there are things getting in the way of you doing the right things for your community, then you should communicate those to them. And then I think they're actively thinking. Remember that everything I say is me as an individual. I'm not speaking on behalf of the ministry, but we have just come out of a very protracted period of difficulty between government and physicians. And the rebuilding of that relationship is going to take a very long time. I think we're likely to get farther faster with primary care providers if we work with groups that they have trust in. And we have a list here: Ontario College of Family Docs, the OMA, AFTO, the Association of Family Health Teams. There are very credible associations out there that understand their communities. And what we're seeing is they're all stepping up to the plate and trying to help their members understand, what does this mean for them? How could this dramatically improve their patients' experiences? You know, many docs, change is concerning, but over time, if they come to realize that instead of everything falling on their shoulders, the system is going to evolve into something that puts many, many services around their most vulnerable patients. And that includes potentially municipal services, housing, and other things. It includes a variety of healthcare services. So I think as they come to appreciate how this could just make their lives so much easier, and then they can focus on what they do best, I think we'll get more and more buy-in. But those organizations strike me as having the trusted relationships with docs, and they're probably better to communicate it in the short run. But I'm sure the ministry is aware of the need to continue to build that relationship with physicians after a very difficult time. And then on the policy questions, those questions about funding are to be determined. But if you have particular views about them, by all means, share them. I do think that, we all have a tremendous opportunity with these teams to shape what they look like. So the more voices that are coming to the table about how to do this, the better. And family health teams, community health centers, there's lots of groups that have really rich assets that they can bring to this conversation that can help to create Ontario health teams that really matter to patients. And I hope you're both reassured by how central primary care is in this model. The whole attribution model is primary care. It's where do you currently go for primary care? And that determines then what that population is that people become accountable for. Other questions or comments? Sorry, yes.
Yes, for teams who've been defined in Discovery,
Yeah.
what is your understanding of the next step for them to move toward full application?
So I guess somewhat similar to the teams in development, but perhaps it's likely to be the case that I would anticipate the next piece of clarity that comes around process will be for teams in development. And then after that, there will be more clarity about what happens with teams in discovery. And I think it's just that the ministry, with so many things going on as part of this transformation, is just having to prioritize, and they want to get a set of teams out there to kind of start to do stuff with the teams invited to full application. Then they have the next wave, and discovery would be that third wave. So it will come. I just would anticipate the clarity will come after it comes for the teams in development. But, one thing I would say about teams in discovery is that I'd strongly encourage you to look, if you are in an area where there are other teams moving to full application and other teams in development, my experience is folks are open to sharing stuff. Ask them if they would be willing to share their referral and utilization map, because what will be very important to you is, are you actually dealing with a naturally occurring network, or are you proposing to deal with a population that is provisionally covered by another group that's just a bit of a step ahead of you in the process? And if you are, then it might be good to open up that line of discussion about whether you would go farther faster as part of that team, as opposed to waiting for the possibility that you would become an independent team. So I would pay attention to that. Yeah, Heather.
I think the other piece of advice for all of the teams is to keep talking, keep working together. I don't think there's a lot of value in waiting to understand clearly what the next steps are. I think you're going to be faster through the next step if you can continue to have the conversations and do the work, because that's where the time is partly with what it takes to get those trusted relationships built. So, I know some teams continue to work after they submitted their application. Other teams waited to see where they were, and I think the teams that continue to work are in a better position now to get to that. Those that are trying to make that October 9th deadline particularly are in a way better position than the ones that waited. So the more that everyone can continue to work in this way and start thinking this way and absorb the idea of working in population health management, the better off we'll all be.